Good morning and welcome to Practical Prioritization for Product People. The speaker this morning is Candase. She is a business architect working for Argon Digital and for the past 12 years, and she helps clients and product owners move to an agile methodology and environment. Her job involves training, coaching, and teaching methods in agile.
Okay, thanks, George. Can everybody hear me? Perfect. Never know with these little mics here. As George said, I'm Candase Hosaken. I am a business architect at Argon Digital. Actually, today is my 12th year anniversary with the company, so it's kind of a dual whammy to be here and get to celebrate that. Lately at Argon Digital, we've been really helping our clients figure out their automation projects. So everybody wants to automate, go faster, get stuff out the door. And a lot of that's, how do you know what's the most valuable processes to automate? The most critical, the most complex, the highest business rules. And I've been working on automation projects for years, although we didn't call them that. We called them middleware, whatever term you want to use. And it was a question I had. Okay, most value, but what does that mean? Is it really just value? Are there other things? And having done this, I was on that project for about 7 years with one team as well. I say one team is 15 development teams spread all over the world. And what I found is obviously it all comes back to value. We want to deliver the most value the fastest, but there are other practical prioritization things to keep in mind as we're managing our backlog. So that was kind of the impetus for this talk, because I find that a lot of POs I talk with are like, well, how do I know what's the most important thing to put at the top of the backlog? Or how do I know to arrange my sprints in such a way that I deliver working software every sprint? So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I know it looks like a long agenda, but I promise there's only like 1 to 2 slides per section. So we will get through it all. But we're going to talk a little bit about why prioritization matters. Why do we even care? Prioritization matters in all of our lives, on every project, but especially in Agile projects. We're then going to talk about a few traditional, I'm going to use that in quotes, prioritization techniques, a few more Agile, again in quotes, Agile aligned prioritization techniques. These are ones that I see more used in Agile projects, but probably not as deeply or as fully embraced as they should be. And Bob actually gave me a great intro in his talk, so we'll lean into that as well. We're going to practice. So we're going to learn 5 different techniques. In every team, we're going to get into groups both virtually and in person and practice prioritizing a backlog and giving our rationale for that prioritization. Then we're going to talk about just those practical considerations. So how do you manage dependencies and other things to keep in mind in addition to whatever your technique is? And then when do you change your prioritization technique? Because that's, I think, one of the biggest mistakes I see POs make is they prioritize and like, I prioritize, I'm done. But no, prioritization is fluid. Things change over time, and so should our prioritization. And then, of course, we'll have some Q&A time at the end. So the product backlog. Our product backlog is everything we need to build. Right? It includes our stories, of course, should be focused on that value, but it includes other things, technical debt, defects, etc. And the Scrum Guide tells us that it should be ordered. It's an ordered list. So it's stack ranked and re-ranked. However, the Scrum Guide gives 0 guidance as to how you order that product backlog. It doesn't say, obviously most value, but that's basically where it ends. So that's the whole realm of prioritization. What do we build first, next, or possibly never? So because it is ordered, every backlog is ordered, right? You have to number them 1, 2, however many items you have. Therefore, every backlog inherently has prioritization, whether you called it that or gave any thought to it when you put them in that order. So they may be informal. There are lots of informal prioritization methods. Your gut, that's a very informal one. I see that a lot. Maybe the squeaky wheel, whoever's yelling the loudest, they get prioritized. Or our hippos, our highest paid person's opinion. All those are prioritization techniques, but today we're going to focus on a little more formal or structured techniques that can help us give us confidence that we have the highest value things at the top of our backlog. And why does this matter? Hopefully we all know this, but we can't build everything at once. And most projects are not going to have enough either people or budget or time to build everything in their backlog. So we have to build what we can and hope that it's the highest value before our funding gets cut. And even if you are one of those miraculous projects that actually has enough time and funding to build everything, you still can't build it all at once. You have to choose what to build first. What are you going to get in the hands of users first? And as I said, next, and again, never. Bob talked a little bit about this, but I believe the most powerful word in a PO's vocabulary is no. We're not going to do that. Because people don't think of it that way, but it's money saved, right? If you don't build things that aren't used, you're saving money. You can build more valuable things. So we have to understand what's realistic. What can we build in the time that we have? And if we do that in a structured and logical manner, it helps us optimize our product delivery. It helps us say, yep, I've got the most valuable thing in. I can continue to, give value, of course, but eventually I can say, yep, I'm done. If we're doing this iteratively, as most of our Agile projects are, we're hopefully building this in such a way that we're building those shippable products. Maybe it's not every sprint, but every release, we're building something that could stand on its own, so that when inevitably the funding gets cut, you have something that's actually usable. I actually had this on my most recent project. It's very date driven. Actually, the date's coming up very quickly here, April 1st. And it's like, oh, are we gonna make the date? And I'm like, well, we're gonna deploy something on the date. Yes. And it will be the highest value things. It may not be everything. And I think that's important as well, is you don't have to deliver everything to be useful, to be valuable. And of course, it all does come back to that value. We want to get the most valuable things, which could be money, it could be cost savings, it could be revenue, it could be hours saved in terms of like automating manual processes. But what is value to your team? What is value to your company? And always driving back to that. So I'm going to give you a little spin on kind of the Agile car story here, just to kind of illustrate that value of incremental delivery. And I've got a couple that I could give. My favorite is actually the Agile house, but I don't have animations for that, so we're going to stick with this one. But imagine you want to open a restaurant, brick and mortar. You dream of owning that restaurant and helping serve food to people, but you got to test out the concept. Well, obviously you don't have to, but you should. You should figure out, like, what do people want to eat? What kind of food? How do you price it? And that could take a long time. It's going to be expensive. You have to save up the money to get the lease. You have to have money to hire people because obviously they want to get paid. They're not going to do it for free. So instead of just sticking to the solution, right? Because the restaurant here is a solution. You go back to the objective. What is our goal behind the solution? Well, our goal is to make money serving delicious food, we hope, to people. So going back to that objective, instead of a restaurant, maybe we do a food cart. We start with food cart. We can be delivering food, people get value immediately, and we're making money close to the first day we start it. We have a much lower investment cost, of course, and we can start getting that feedback. We can quickly iterate and say, hey, maybe I started with Mexican food and found out, nope, there's lots of Mexican food places in Austin, so we're going to switch to something else. Or maybe we start with barbecue and switch to, fusion Korean barbecue, I think I saw in the last food truck. So you can get this quick feedback, you can figure out what people want, and maybe after all that, you realize you don't need a restaurant, you really just need a food truck. And maybe you can have multiple food trucks. And so you can be all over the city, you can find out where people want to get their food. Because a restaurant, obviously, you're very stuck. You're stuck wherever that physical location is. But with a food truck or a vendor cart, you can go wherever the people are. So you realize your original solution really wasn't the one that was going to help you achieve your goals the fastest. So I find when we're talking about prioritization, it's always good to go back to those objectives. What are we trying to get out of a release, a product, a project that we're trying to do? Not necessarily the solution itself, because the solution is how we achieve those objectives. And the how can always change. The how could be much smaller or much bigger than we expected. So going back to software, of course, there's value in getting feedback in our restaurant example or in your Agile house, but it's just as equally important, if not more, in software. It helps us identify problems sooner. If you don't know if something's going to succeed, you want to find that sooner rather than later, that fail fast mentality. Ideally, if we're doing it right and not just haphazardly creating code, it helps us reduce our technical debt because we're always inspecting and adapting and getting better. It helps us increase our visibility. So anyone on the team can see where we're at in the backlog, can see where we're at in the sprint, which hopefully builds that trust because they have that visibility, which makes both our product and Agile itself more likely to be adopted and meet our objectives. And lastly, of course, this one I loved because Bob gave me a great intro to this. In a lot of cases, you could be done way earlier than you planned. So, we talk about the 80-20 rule. You may build 20% of the functionality and find out that that's good enough. Maybe you don't need anything else to meet your users' needs. So you can go on to more other valuable activities. Bob talked about his product where they only use 35% of the features. That's actually really common. There was a study 2007, 2008-ish that found that 65% of features in any given software product are rarely or never used. So if we can find those, if we can help prioritize that we build the 35% first, and we're smart enough to cut off the tail and say, yep, we're done, then we can go on to the next thing and the next thing and keep building more value for our companies. So now that we're hopefully all aligned on the value of it, incremental delivery and why we care about prioritization, we're going to talk about kind of the two most common prioritization methods. So the first one, this is the one I see most commonly, is just straightforward by benefit or value. So in this case, this one's, again, probably one of the more simpler ones outside of obviously your gut feel or highest paid person's opinion. Here, the PO or product person would work with their stakeholders or their customers or whoever can give that input, and they take every story or feature and they assign a value to it. That could be a relative value, it could be dollar value, but somehow we have values and then we order them. Highest value at the top, going on down. And the good thing about prioritization, all prioritization, is it's relative. It is not absolute. So if you only have one requirement, you don't need to have any prioritization. But as soon as you have a second requirement or a second user story, you have to have prioritization because one of them has to come first. So because it's relative though, that means your numbers don't have to be accurate. It doesn't have to be perfect. They just have to be good enough relative to each other. So even if you're off by an order of magnitude, as long as all of your estimates are off by an order of magnitude, you're still going to end up with the right prioritization. And even, obviously we're stack ranking, it's in an explicit order, but the exact spot in the backlog doesn't matter so much as where it comes into delivery. Does it get into the right increment, the right release to get into the user's hands in the right order? Not necessarily that, it's user story 5 instead of user story 6. So we want to keep that in mind when we're doing this. So we go through, we find our value, hopefully being able to put that either dollar value, size value, whatever metric you're using, and build them in that order. The good news, of course, is that we get our highest value thing first, whatever that was. So, if we use I love at Argonne Digital, and if I slip up and call it C-level, that's what it used to be called. We rebranded a couple of years ago. We love business objectives, and we have a model called the business objectives model, which says, why are we doing this project? What's the value we're going to get out of it? And with that, you can tie all of your features, and then user stories, of course, back to those objectives, which all should have dollar values. I'm going to increase sales by X dollars. I'm going to decrease costs by X amount. So you could stack rank based on the features that support your highest value business objectives. So we get our early delivery of value. And of course, assuming you didn't do this in a vacuum and you did this with your stakeholders or customers, someone's happy because they're getting that value first. However, we don't know the cost. Like think back to our restaurant example. Maybe the restaurant would have made us the most money, right? Because it's bigger, you can serve more people, but it also had the highest investment cost, the highest people cost. So it's going to take us a lot longer to get that ROI than a food vendor cart. So our costs are unknown. We don't know if that highest value thing is really feasible within our budget and our timeline. And then, of course, there's always the question of benefit to whom. So it can be hard, especially if you have a diverse set of stakeholders, for them to agree on what the most valuable thing is. And that's going to be a recurring theme, by the way, of getting that consensus. So if value alone isn't enough, well, maybe we take in the cost. So that's the next one here, cost benefit analysis or CBA. So here, same thing, we have our value. We've worked with our stakeholders or our customers, but in addition to that, we get a rough sizing. And again, this is all relative. It could be t-shirt sizing, story point sizing, whatever thing that says, hey, this is roughly this much effort. Then we divide our value by our effort or cost. And again, stack rank them. Highest number wins. This ideally gives us those quickest wins, the most bang for our buck, right? Because I get to spend the least amount to get my highest value. So it lets us order our backlog by those fastest wins and gives us that reality check, because maybe it's a super, I can save $1 million, but it's also going to cost me 5 million to save that 1 million. So does that really make sense? It helps give us that ROI, and does it really make sense to build the thing? And if everybody's bought in to both the sizing and the value, it can give a little greater objectivity, right? Because it's not just your gut feel. It's not well, there's always some hand waving, but it's less hand waving than some of the other functions. So you can get that greater objectivity. However, of course, you have to get that rough sizing. And the people who can give that are usually your engineers and your developers who are, presumably developing. And so that can be tough, especially if the PO is working ahead of the team, because in an ideal world, all activities, not just development, but even our activities as POs refining those stories should be done in priority order. I don't want to spend a lot of time digging into APIs and documentation for a story that's never going to be built. I want to be prioritizing my work according to the most value as well. So it can be hard to get that sizing sometimes. Obviously, accuracy, again, they're all relative, so it doesn't have to be perfectly accurate, but we want them to be semi-accurate. Since this is relative, it's not the biggest concern here, but it can be hard, especially if you have different groups doing the sizing. So if you have one group sizing one set of stories and a different group sizing another set, they may have used different scales. And so that can make it hard to have that relative prioritization still work out. And this one, again, is going to be a common theme. It doesn't always factor in all the other things. So, maybe your smallest, most valuable feature is dependent on some middleware layer or some infrastructure story that's down at the bottom of the list because nobody cares about the infrastructure story. Well, great, we can deliver that small one fast, but it's not usable because we didn't deliver the thing that it was dependent on. So we're going to talk a lot about that later on. So we quickly went through those two. And so far we've talked about value, of course, and cost. But on top of that, there are other things we have to keep in mind. So one of those things is technical risk. Maybe we're doing something that we don't know if will work, or we're doing a new technology. When I first started, MongoDB was all the rage and everyone was like, oh, it's gonna be amazing. And then it is, but it's basically just another database. So those new technologies, do you know if it's going to work? Maybe you're doing something that no one has ever done before. You want to find that out sooner rather than later. As we said, fail fast. There's also business risk and opportunity cost that we have to take into play. Yet maybe it's the most valuable thing, but if it takes too long, we might miss our window to be the first to market, to get it into the customer's hands. Can you imagine a world in which Samsung beat Apple to the iPhone? Obviously, they wouldn't have called it that, but to the smartphone, what a different world we would have lived in. But Apple obviously got there first, so they got so much of that market because of that. So because of that, we're going to talk about three more techniques here that build in a little more of that technical risk, business risk, and opportunity costs. And then we're going to practice. It's going to be fun. Okay, so we're going to talk about the sometimes bad three-letter acronym I hear all the time now, the MVP, or the minimum viable product. This has gotten kind of a bad rep at a lot of places for usually pretty good reasons. One, most people consider this just the first release. Whatever your first release is, that's the MVP. Or it's the first release that doesn't really get you everything you wanted. So we're going to label that the MVP because we couldn't finish everything we wanted to in the right time. Or worse, people say, yep, you're going to call it an MVP, but then you're going to close the project and I'm never going to hear from you again. All right, so all those are reasons why this has gotten kind of a bad reputation, but it's not necessarily the first release, although it often is. It's really about what is usable, what gets something into our users' hands that we can build off of. It's not necessarily meant to be, I delivered an MVP and I'm done. It's I delivered an MVP and I get feedback and I make it better over time. So it's really thinking about that minimal aspect of that. And so when I go in and talk with people, their MVP is probably way bigger than it needs to be. That minimal viable product is always smaller than you think, because there are always other ways you can do things. Again, I talked about my April 1st go live. It's an automation project. We're automating manual processes, but we don't have to automate everything. If we automate the things that happen every day, does it matter that I didn't automate the transaction that happens once a quarter? Probably not. In an ideal world, sure, I would want everything automated. I would want no users, great. But that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where I have to deploy something on April 1st, and it better be the highest value or highest volume, in my case, because it's automation, transactions. So thinking back to that minimum viable product, it's not necessarily even your final solution, right? If we think back to our restaurant case, that was a solution. But if we think to our objectives, which was delivering food for people, our solution, our minimum viable product, could be much smaller than what that original solution was. So when we're prioritizing by that minimum viable product, we always have to think outside the box. And I love that Bob had talked about minimum viable everything, right? What's the minimum amount of documentation? What's the minimum amount of automation? What's the smallest piece? Are there other ways that aren't software? Because we're all software people, or at least I think we're all software people. We tend to think in software. We tend to think that that's what's going to solve our problems. It can, but there are other ways too. So we want to be thinking outside that box. The next one here, kind of similar, is the minimum marketable feature or feature set. This is less about what's usage and more about what's marketable. So minimum viable product is usually used if there's an opportunity cost. If you want to get into the market quickly, you have to get something into the hands of your users or customers fastest. The minimum marketable feature set, try saying that 3 times fast, is more about what is marketable. What can I get people to buy something or adopt something? So this version of prioritization is usually used if you're trying to enter an already saturated market because there are already competitors there. So people have expectations. And so if you don't meet those expectations, you're going to fail. As opposed to a minimum viable product, if there's no one there, well, there are no expectations yet. So you can get that feedback and grow over time. This MMF is also used a lot in system replacements because, again, people are using a current system. You have to replace it with another system. So they have expectations about how they've been using that system over time. Now, I want to note, because this is minimum, a system replacement doesn't just mean blindly replacing all features, because as we talked about, up to 65% of those features are rarely or never used. But we do have to make sure that we're replacing the ones that the users care about. So we really want to focus on what are they using today and make sure that that's in that minimum marketable feature set. Because both of these focus on that minimal aspect, they share a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses. So we'll go into that here. Obviously, if you are truly focused on that minimum, bare bones, what is the smallest sliver that I can deliver? You should have faster time to market. You should be able to deploy faster because you're not trying to build 100% of the scope. You're trying to build 25% of the scope or 15% of the scope. It can, if you are vigilant, help you with that cost control because you can use those words. No, sorry, that's not in the MVP. You don't really need that right now. We'll maybe get to it later. And of course, it can help give you that competitive advantage if you can get into that market faster, get feedback faster, and give people what they want. The downside, as I said, for a lot of these, it's hard to get consensus. What's minimal for one person is not necessarily minimal for the next person. I've had these conversations with so many business stakeholders where I'm like, do you really need that? And they're like, oh, absolutely 100%. I need this in the MVP. And it's like, okay, let's figure this out. And the hard part is when it gets into scope creep. I can't tell you how many times we're marching toward that go live date, April 1st for this example. And someone at the last minute comes in and says, I absolutely have to have this feature. Can we get it in? Well, a good PO or product person has to be able to weigh the cost and say, do we really need it? Is it critical? If it is, we may have to push something else out. We may have to make trade-offs. Or we could just say no. Again, my favorite word. We also have to balance this, though, with what's realistic, always going back to those objectives or our goals. On a recent project that I was integrating to HR systems, so we had an HR system that was running like our HR and benefit stuff, and then a payroll system that we were integrating with. And so the payroll system that was receiving the data obviously did payroll, paid everybody. And for some reason, don't ask me why, but the payroll system didn't actually require your pay rate to create an employee. So you could create an employee with $0 pay. And so one of the BAs I worked with was like, well, it's not required. We're doing an MVP, so we're not going to map that field. And as a good product person, I went back to my goal, which was we wanted to integrate these systems without impacting the employees, and the employees want to get paid, presumably. So I was like, yes, it's not technically required, but we really need to, because otherwise we're not going to meet our goals. If I integrate this system and I run payroll and everybody gets paid $0, well, I'm going to be out of the state somewhere where they can't find me. Let's put it that way. So we have to look at both of those pieces, both yes, saying no and making it as small as possible, but also realizing what is valuable, what is useful for meeting our goals. The next one up is our walking skeleton. So the walking skeleton is similar to an MVP in that, again, we're thinking about that smallest sliver, that the minimal amount of stuff that we can build. But in this case, it's more process oriented. So I have Alistair Cockburn's definition up here. So a tiny implementation of end-to-end functionality or end-to-end process. So one of the ways we do this usually is, we'll talk about a story map in a minute. We think through the end-to-end user process, and we think about what's the smallest amount of development or code that we can build to support an end-to-end process. So one project I was on was about automating leasing for customers. So you have to book the lease, you have to service the lease, you have to invoice the customer, of course. You have to collect on those invoices if they don't pay. And eventually they're going to return the equipment, right, in the lease or buy out the equipment. So a walking skeleton would be the simplest use case of that. So I can do everything end to end, right? I can book the lease, but it's only for standard terms, standard pricing, standard vehicles, no special features or anything like that. Again, standard invoicing, standard everything, but I can do it end to end. You want special pricing? Nope, that's next release. Sorry. Now, an MVP could also be valid in this case, but an MVP might focus on, well, I just need to book the lease. I can invoice them manually later. And right, and I have, presumably, let's say it's a car, 3 years before they're going to return that vehicle. So I don't need to worry about ending the lease for 3 more years. So my MVP might just be, I can book the lease. I sold it, I booked it, I'm good. Whereas a walking skeleton at least looks at that end-to-end process. So similarly, like that MVP or MMF, if you are focused on that tiniest sliver, that minimal amount, you get that faster time to market. Then because you are looking at that end-to-end process, you have something that is end-to-end. Again, maybe it's the tiniest implementation of it, but you're not trying to scramble 3 years from now, being like, wait, who forgot to build the things so that we could end this lease? And how do we do that now? Because most of the time, the same person who decided that MVP is not necessarily the one 3 years later when the first lease comes up for ending. And here we're going with the story map, especially if you're using those story maps, it's easier to visualize the scope. You can use a story map, or I use feature trees. There's lots of ways to visualize scope regardless of your prioritization method. But because the walking skeleton is process-based, and story maps are also in the order that users do the processes, it's a little easier to visualize that. Similar to MVP and MMF, it can be hard to get that consensus. What is that smallest sliver of implementation? You always want that scope creep. And of course, because you're building something end to end, you might build more than you need. Maybe you don't actually need the full end-to-end process. Maybe only booking the lease was enough because we didn't know this now, but we're going to go under in 2 years. So it doesn't matter that we know how to end the lease. Hopefully that's not the case, but it's hard to know the future. So you could build something that will never be used. And so I talked about this story mapping. So story mapping, defined by the Agile Alliance, is mapping all of our user stories across 2 dimensions. Across the horizontal axis here is our epics and features, roughly in the order of which a user would take actions or do processes. And then on the vertical axis are stories, going from complexity or priority. So if we align our stories to our features and our epics, the very first row, that would be our walking skeleton, the smallest implementation. And I probably have more stories on here than I needed to, but it's to illustrate the point. So this would be our release 1, our walking skeleton. And then we could have multiple other horizontal rows beneath this for our future releases. And so here, again, as I said, you can do an MVP or an MMF with the same kind of view here and just say, yep, this first one is our first release. But because that walking skeleton or this story map is in process order, it aligns better to that walking skeleton. So I love story maps. I love feature trees. I love just visualization. So it's a really good way to see our scope. And lastly, weighted shortest job first. So this one came out of SAFe, or Scaled Agile Framework. This is probably the most formal or scientific of the methods we're going to talk about today. Here, similar to our cost benefit analysis, we prioritize or size stories against 4 different areas. So value, of course, we talked about, criticality, risk, and of course the size. Once we have all 4 aspects of our stories, we then calculate a score similar to our cost benefit analysis. So it's value plus risk plus criticality divided by your effort. The good news here, it's more comprehensive. You have those other perspectives that you didn't have in a cost benefit analysis or an MVP. You've got that criticality, you've got that business opportunity. It's more objective, assuming everyone agrees on the sizing, because it's clear you have all the sizings, everybody can see how you got to the score. And thus it's easy to reference, because ideally you have a little table that says, here are all my scores, here's how I got it, and here's how you got to the top of the list. But it's also a little more time consuming, because everybody has to then size for all 4 of these dimensions, preferably independently, and then do all the calculations. It can be hard to agree on those numbers, get that consensus, of course. People always will want to massage the numbers to get their feature to wind up on top, so you have to fight against that. It can be hard to get that accuracy again with people doing it in. And with all of these, you're missing those intangibles. Yep, it floated to the top, but again, maybe I haven't thought about who's in what part of the code base. What do I have dependencies on? So we're going to take a quick look here. So to do this, typically from a SAFe perspective, you'd use the Fibonacci sequence just like you would when you size stories for Sprint. You do that same sizing, but for all 4 aspects. One of the key things here, just like with sizing user stories, is to pick what that one story point story is. So you say, I don't know, an email notification brings me 1 story point of value, and then everything else is relative to that. Well, the next thing brings me 2 times as much value, so that's a 2, 3 times, so on and so forth, with that Fibonacci scale. You score all of these one at a time, so we don't want to introduce any favoritism. So we don't do these story by story, we do them group by group. So we do all of the sizing, all of the value, all of the criticality, all of the risk. Once every column has a score, then you calculate it with our equation up there, and our highest score should win. So here, the highest score is actually 20, even though it's not the highest value. We have a 20 value story here, but it takes a long time to build it. It's a 13 size. So it actually ends up almost at the bottom of our list here. So this is a nice way to just kind of get those objective scorings, but there's other things that we have to consider. And we'll talk about that after our practice. So I just gave you guys a bunch of information, but I found it's always better to practice. We're going to get into groups of 3 to 5, and I don't have enough papers probably for everyone, so the groups will have to share. But what we have is everybody's going to have the exact same backlog. So in this case, it's from one of my real projects, 10 plus years ago now, of commercial credit. So we're going to offer a line of revolving credit to our big commercial customers, and we want to automate that credit decisioning. So we'll have a list of features of how we could automate that credit decisioning, and each group will have a method to do the prioritization and some instructions here. With that, I want you to prioritize, so stack rank. We've got the list of features, stack ranking, and rationale. And in addition to the stack ranking, I also want you to say, what is our first release candidate? What is the thing that we can release first? Is it the whole backlog? I hope not, given that we're talking about prioritization. But what is that smallest piece based on your prioritization technique that we're using? Okay, so find your groups. So this middle group here is going to do the MVP, all of this area. Our middle folks here are going to do walking skeleton. You guys get WSJF, lovely. You guys will get the WSJF, and our virtual folks, I have the attachment in the Slack channel. They will be doing the MMF. Okay, where's my groups? I'm gonna just put a couple out. So I got 30 copies. Is there another group over here? I think. Oh, did you guys not get one yet? Yeah. Hello.
Thanks. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Now that I have some extras, I want to make sure I had one for each group at least. There's some extras, so multiple people can look at it. Some extras.
Guess we need to
Some extra one. You guys are just 2. That's some extra copies. Some extra copies. Extras. There's another just so you guys have multiple. Oh wow, this is like 5 minutes, but yeah, we may have to.
Okay, 'cause we'll be pressing the time.
And I know it's not enough time, but we're only gonna have about 3 more minutes just because we're getting close on time here.
Just gonna summarize, you're gonna try and have each one of them give.
No, yeah.
Okay. I was gonna say, in a meetup, you'd have each one of them.
Well, and ideally, I was gonna have at least one group from each type, but we don't have time for that.
Like I said, running 5 long is not a problem. 10 is pushing.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, just 1 more minute, 1 more minute. 1 more minute. 1 minute. Yep, I know it's real short. 1 minute. Yep.
That's your.
Whatever. Okay. Can everybody come back? I know that was not long enough. I'm gonna have to start clapping. You can hear me clap once. You can hear me clap twice. You can hear me clap 3 times. Oh, okay. I know that wasn't long enough. You guys are welcome to take this back and finish prioritizing your backlog. It is in the Slack channel if you want to have your own copy of it. Ideally, we'd walk through all the different types and see how the groups prioritized. So for example, in an MVP, it might just be literally receiving the request and rendering a decision. And that decision is always yes. Right? That's the simplest thing. That's the smallest thing I could build is I get the request and you are always approved for whatever amount, $10,000. Now that's risky, right? Because you may be giving credit to people who shouldn't have credit, but it's the smallest implementation you can do, right? Versus a MMF, well, maybe that has a little more features because you want to make sure you're not giving it to fraudulent customers or you want to get their credit score. Walking skeleton, of course, since it's focused on that end to end, at least has to have a way to service it and close out the account. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's just those 4. And I know WSJF, you guys did not get to size everything by all 4 categories. But your highest one might have been something like pulling the credit bureau report. But you can't pull the credit bureau report until you understand who the customer is, right? So that's where you talk about those dependencies. So there are lots of different ways to prioritize. It's probably smaller than you think. So just a couple questions. Was it easy to get consensus? Did everybody agree in the short amount of time you had on what should be prioritized first in your backlog? For the most part? Okay. So sometimes it's not as easy to get that consensus. Nope. Yeah. Okay. And I'm happy to stay and talk more about kind of, especially for this specific example, if you have any questions. But we're going to go quickly because we got 5 minutes left and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So we talked about 5 different prioritization methods. right? They all have their strengths and weaknesses. So you may be wondering, well, which one should I choose? Well, unfortunately, as I am a consultant, it depends. And it all comes back to your goals, business objectives and product goals, yes, but also your goals for your release. What do you want to get out of releasing something to the customer? Is it more important to break into a new market, be the fastest to market, or please our, delight our customers? All of those goals will help determine what prioritization method you use. And now, in addition to whatever technique you use, so that technique gives you a first pass. That tells you here's, a rough ordering. There are a lot of other things you have to keep in mind because that rough ordering is not necessarily the exact order you should build in. So we have to think about dependencies. Managing dependencies in your own backlog is easy enough, right? I have to search for the customer before I can update the customer. But how do you manage dependencies across teams? What if I'm dependent on someone else to deliver something for me? That gets a little trickier. We have to think about our functional area. Hopefully, in an ideal world, a product person wouldn't need to know this. But knowing how your product is structured, like where the story will be implemented, like physically in the code, can help divvy up stories so that you have a diversity of scope across your developers. So I worked on a project that had 15 development teams all in the same code base. So over 100 engineers in any given sprint. And so knowing where those stories were built was really important because if I put them all in one service, they were going to be stepping all over each other's code and toes. So I had to know a little bit about the functional area. And then you need to at least keep in mind your skills and your preferences of your engineers. Obviously, we always want, full stack developers who can do everything, but that's not the reality. A lot of companies go agile, in quotes here, but they keep their horizontal team structure. So I had a project where to get one field from the UI to the database, 5 different teams. 5 different teams to capture that field, pass it, store it, pass it up. Because we kept that horizontal structure. We didn't go into those vertical products. So we have to keep in mind that. You may also have different skills of your team members. So you want to keep, maybe their back end versus front end or middleware, whatever their specialty is. So you have to balance that as well. Just like 2 more slides, I promise. When we talk about dependencies across teams, so if I have a dependency in my backlog, great. I can link them together, keep them in the right order, no problem. But if I have a dependency on someone else, I have to align that dependency. So SAFe does this through their PI planning, where everybody comes together and they line out all the dependencies on the PI board. I like an analogy I was taught by one of my old coworkers, the rocks in the river. So the POs work together. So I'm the PO and I talk to a dependent team. We decide what sprint that's going to be in or what release. That becomes a rock in the backlog. It cannot move. Other things can move around it. So things can come in. See if my animations work. Things can move, but the rock stays put, whether that's a sprint, a release, order in the backlog, whatever. And can sometimes come up. So for example, if I said I was going to deliver in sprint 3, but I'm able to deliver it earlier because I take something else out, that's probably okay. But I can't push it out, at least without talking to that other PO. So this requires that constant communication to make sure that our rocks stay put. But it allows everything else to flow around those dependencies. Lastly, my last topic for today is when should you change prioritization techniques? So I've prioritized my backlog, I'm done, right? No. So when your goal changes, at least every release, you should be thinking about what is our goal for this release and changing your prioritization method accordingly. So I see a lot of teams that start with an MVP or a walking skeleton, that smallest implementation. They get something out the door, but maybe it's not great. Maybe it's not fully baked. They get a lot of user complaints or performance issues. So then they come in with like a minimum marketable feature set or a minimum lovable product, the MLP, or use Kano analysis to bring in some delighters. At any time, they could go to a WSJF for a cost benefit analysis. But it's all, what are you trying to get out of that release? What are we trying to deliver to our customers? And some key takeaways here. So I gave you guys a lot of information on 5 different techniques. You guys can look that up later. But the 3 things I want you to take away from this 45 minutes is that there's lots of ways to prioritize. And it's not as easy or straightforward as you may think. There are lots of other factors. So in addition to just getting that list, you have to think about all those other intangibles. Who's building it? How are they going to build it? Where are they going to build it? And as I think Bob talked a little bit about this, there's no one right answer. There's no one prioritization method to rule them all. It can and will change over time. And with that, we'll go to questions. And I've got a landing page if you want to get some additional resources. You can scan that QR code. And with that, do we have any questions? I see a question. You've got the.
So with all these different techniques, there are different times to use each of them. When you're in an organization, I could see the value of having clear statements about that, this is the way we do this one, this is the way we do the other one. But how do you manage those external communications, whether with stakeholders or just other parts of the organization, when you're shifting? Like sometimes you're in this prioritization mode, sometimes you're in that one. They're always going to ask you for the justification. So what challenges have you seen with that?
Usually it's about getting them to agree on those objectives. So if we can agree on the highest level business objectives, then we can talk through, well, to meet, to walk toward that business objective, we did an MVP at first, but now we're switching to, say, a minimum business increment or some other prioritization method, because we've built the base and now we need to grow it so that we can meet that final business objective. So again, it's hard to get them to agree on those business objectives, but if you can, I find that always helps. Otherwise, it's just over communication. That's the only other thing I found that really works, is just always be telling them, this is why we are doing it. This is why we're changing or where we're going. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. One over here. Is there any virtual questions? No? Okay. Wait for the microphone so they can hear you on the.
No, I can be loud.
Oh, it's just so they can hear you on the Zoom.
So is the release planning is part of the, where does it fit in the Agile sprints and Scrum? I mean, as far as we understood, I mean, we're not Agile experts yet. We're not practicing that level yet, but as far as I understood, every sprint you got to deliver something.
So every sprint should deliver something that could be released. It doesn't mean you have to release it. And so release planning comes in determining how many sprints do you need to deliver something that's usable. But the problem, if you deliver something every 2 weeks, you could have customers very confused because you're changing things on them every 2 weeks. So the release planning goes in there and says, how many sprints do I need? Maybe it is every 2 weeks, but maybe it's every 3 sprints or every 4 sprints. So SAFe tends to use a 4 to 5 sprint release planning cycle. So it could vary. More than about 6 sprints, you're probably waiting too long, is kind of my rule of thumb. Okay. And we are over time, but I will stick around if you have any questions, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you.